You are now attending the webinar entitled American Antisemitism in the 20th Century. Our leader for the session is Kirsten Fermaglich, Professor of History and Jewish Studies, Department of History, Michigan State University. I also want to note that we are joined by two members of our Teacher Advisory Council, Rachel Lance, Porter High School, Petersburg, and from what I understand, Joel Lance has indicated that he knows her. Shout out to Joel as well. We also have Bernadette May Beaver, who is at the Lovett School, Atlanta, Georgia. They're both members of this year's Teacher Advisory Council who will serve as our TAs for tonight's session. They will be active in the chat, sharing thoughts and resources and asking questions. Kirsten Fermaglich is Professor of History and Jewish Studies at Michigan State University. Her most recent book, A Rosenberg by Any Other Name, A History of Jewish Name Changing in America, was awarded the Saul Wiener Book Prize by the American Jewish Historical Society in June 2019. Fermaglich is also the author of American Dreams and Nazi Nightmares, Early Holocaust Consciousness and Liberal America, 1957-1965, and co-editor of the Norton Critical Edition of Betty Friedan, The Feminine Mystique, with Lisa Fine. From 2016 through 2021, she was co-editor of the journal American Jewish History, along with Daniel Sawyer and Adam Mendelsohn. She is also co-author with Yale Aronoff, Ariana Menzel, and Amy Simon of the Sterling Institute Guide on Antisemitism for the Michigan State University community. She is currently pursuing two research projects. One looks at the history of anti-Semitism in the federal government, and the other focuses on the migration of Jewish academics to college towns through the South and Midwest in the years after World War II. Again, thank you so much, Kirsten, for joining us. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to have you with us tonight, and we're all collectively looking forward to your talk.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Mike, for that really lovely introduction, and thank you so much for introducing me. I just want to make sure you can hear me. And I just want to say, thank you to Mike Williams and to Raven Ferguson for helping to make this possible, and to everyone who's been involved in it. And thank you all to the audience. You all seem really wonderful, and thank you for being teachers, which is just a wonderful profession. So, so I'll get started. I'm going to move to my first panel, Anti-Semitism in the 20th Century, and it should be American Anti-Semitism in the 20th Century, sorry for that. And I wanted to sort of start off, we've been doing at MSU, we've been doing a lot of sort of training about anti-Semitism. We've been trying to work with resident assistants and things like that. So we've been doing a lot of talking about anti-Semitism. So I wanted to just kind of start with, a content warning, which I sort of have been talking with people in our DEI office about the importance of that. There are really ugly stereotypes. Some of the images that I'm going to show will be ugly. There will be a few images of violence that might also be disturbing, so just be prepared for those. It's not terrible. I've tried to curate them, but they are there, so do be prepared for them. And at the end of this first, what I thought I would do in the beginning is just talk a little bit about anti-Semitism. I noticed in the chat before we started, some people seem like they have, a pretty good understanding and a background of Jewish culture or of anti-Semitism, and then other people, at least one person said that they don't tend to teach that, and I don't know how much people know. So what I thought I would do with the first segment is just talk briefly about who Jews are, and then introduce some stereotypes that we'll be referring to throughout the rest of the talk. So the first part of this is going to be just about sort of general anti-Semitism, and I actually think that this can be I think this is a really useful, good way of starting to talk with students about anti-Semitism in the United States as well, just because it gets at some stereotypes that people might have internalized, but not necessarily even really realize that that's what they are. So I usually start off with just this panel, who are Jews, because sometimes people aren't aware. And one of the really important things to kind of get out there that I think is really useful to talk about is that, Judaism is a religion. and that's frequently how it's understood in the American context. It's how American Jews have frequently been understood. It also is an ethnicity. It's a group of people who identify themselves by their heritage, by nationality. It can be a nation, right? Jews have in the past understood themselves as a nation, Jews in Israel from a nation state, which is complicated because it's obviously not only Jews in Israel, but in the past, Jews understood themselves as a nation, a system of ethics, a shared memory of the past. Jews, this kind of tension between Jews as a religion and ethnicity, the different kinds of ways that Jews can be identified, can sometimes be something that can be confusing for students. So it's important to realize most of the rest of this talk that I'm going to give is going to talk more about Jews being treated as a race. Being kind of racialized and discriminated against as a race. But it's important to understand that sometimes that has come up against understandings of Jews as a religion, but all these things have been ways that Jews have understood themselves and have been understood by others. Jews originated in the ancient land of Israel, but they were expelled in 70 CE and settled throughout the world. So Jews are a really diverse group. So there's little tiny pictures down at the bottom. I don't know how large that is for you. Jews can be seen as, sort of different racial backgrounds in terms of thinking of skin color and the way that Americans typically tend to think about race. So there are Jews of all different kinds of racial backgrounds in terms of thinking about, Asian Americans, Black Americans can all be Jewish, and that's true throughout the world. It also helps to explain that Jews are just really diverse within their grouping. So attempts to racialize them and treat them as a race kind of bump up against that diversity, and that's important to understand. The majority of American Jews have been Ashkenazic, have been Eastern European, but that is not the only definition of Jews by any means, and I'm happy to talk more about that if people have questions. But the message of diversity is really important. The final kind of statistic just to kind of give you, or the final information to give you that I think is really important, is to understand how small Jews are as a percentage of the world population and as a percentage of the US population. About 40% of the world's Jewish population lives in the United States. So within the world Jewish population, the American Jewish population is pretty significant, but they're a really tiny percentage of the US population and an even tinier percentage of the world population. And that's important. That will be important as we go on and talk about some of the stereotypes about Jews and some of the ways that Jews have been understood. I think there's frequently kind of stereotypes that Jews are a much larger percentage of the population. And so it's important for me, at least, to start out kind of understanding, having people understand that. Okay, and so for this brief introduction to anti-Semitism, I'm going to give kind of a working definition. Anti-Semitism is rhetoric, discrimination, prejudice, hostility, and or violence against Jews or Jewish institutions. It also includes the promotion of anti-Jewish conspiracy theories. It's important to note there actually are a number of different definitions, and they've created a lot of controversy. But this is kind of just a working definition to kind of get us by, and this will encompass all the kinds of anti-Semitism that I'm going to talk about that have really been significant in American history. This is kind of the ways that I and my co-authors for my work on anti-Semitism have sort of talked about it. And again, this kind of gives a good understanding of what we'll be talking about in the rest of the talk. And I'm going to organize the rest of this around tropes. So different stereotypes or myths or ideas that have been used in anti-Semitic language and events over time. So these are tropes that have existed, and people tend to call anti-Semitism the longest hatred. There's some complications about that. But these kinds of images of Jews are very, very old. They are, exist, before, they exist, certainly since sort of the, an early Christian era when Jews have been sort of understood in a number of different ways. So I'm going to go through, I believe it's 5 tropes. And again, they're quite old. I'm going to show you images in more recent contexts, some American, some European, but they're tropes that you may have seen, and there's lots of different ways of kind of identifying them. And as I say, sometimes people don't even see them. So this is actually an image from the populist movement. This is from a populist newspaper from 1896. I actually can't see my notes from this vision. So all of my footnotes, all of my citations for my images are in the footnotes. So I can't see them, but I believe this is from 1896 from the journal Sound Money. And you can see actually that this is explicit in saying this is the U.S. in the hands of Jews. But if you look to the left and the right, there are these kinds of images of Jews as bankers, as Wall Street figures, and the association of Jews with money has been sort of a very, very classic trope that's existed since early Christianity. It's been originated, Jews have sometimes worked in financial fields, but certainly they certainly don't control capitalism or money. And yet for centuries, they've been identified with money, greed, capitalism. And so this can include stereotypes of Jews being cheap, right? So the term to Jew someone down, which I've had students tell me this is something they grew up, using and not thinking twice about. Comes from this kind of vision. Jews, bargaining people down, right, is a pretty constant stereotype. Exploiting others for money, embodying capitalism, right? So like in this cartoon, Jews are kind of seen as the embodiment of capitalism, controlling banks. All of these are stereotypes that frequently are used to sort of, as in this image, it is identified for sort of frontally being talking about Jews, right? But it can also involve sort of talking about Jews without talking about Jews. So sometimes discussions of George Soros, for example, can sort of use that stand-in of a wealthy Jew, but it's not actually talking about the Jews. And so that is a trope that shows up over and over again that is important to sort of note and think about. And I'll point out there are a few places, I believe, in this discussion where that will come up. Another trope is one of Jews as subhuman. This is again for centuries really that have been some early images of Jews in medieval figuration. Jewish bodies have been visualized as subhuman, and so there are different kinds of physical characteristics that supposedly mark Jews. So Jews having large noses is constant, and if we go back up to the picture that I just showed you, I don't know if I can go backwards, but if you go up to this image, part of the way you know that these figures are Jews is through these large hook noses, which is sort of a cartoon image of who the Jews are. But there's also Jews having weak bodies, Jews carrying disease, Jews having horns, Jews having cloven feet. The image that I am showing on the right comes from the Dreyfus affair, which was an affair in the late 19th century in France, where a Jewish captain was accused of treason, and he was a fully assimilated, he didn't look Jewish in any way, he was a military man, and yet this was the image of him, right, that he is hunched over, he's animalistic, right, he has a large nose, he has something that can be taken as horns, he has, a body that's the shape of an ape, right. These are all kinds of ways that Jews have been sort of physically imagined to look different. This is not always the way that people imagine Jews, and in the United States, because of the dominant vision of race being about skin color, a lot of times white Jews who come from Europe aren't necessarily seen automatically as having different physical characteristics, but within anti-Semitism and within a longer history, and even today, a lot of these images, a lot of these kinds of imaginations of what Jews' bodies look like are still present. Another trope is the Jews as being part of a global conspiracy. So there's a pervasive belief that Jews seek to establish global dominance by controlling or manipulating people through politics, economy, or media. You may have heard, Hollywood, being controlled by Jews, and therefore controlling the world. The protocols of the elders of Zion, we're going to talk much more about that later in this talk, but it's one very famous iteration of this belief. This is an English version, but it's been translated and published in multiple languages throughout the world, believing that Jews, sort of conspire to bring down Western civilization. You can see actually in this picture another figuration of the Jews as subhuman. This Jew is visioned as a snake, kind of controlling the world. So the Protocols is one of the most, one of the recent. It's from the early 20th century, but this is actually also an older belief as well that Jews sought to dominate and control Christians as part of an older vision of Jews. Another trope that really became much more significant in the 19th and the 20th century worldwide is the trope of the Jew as a radical. Jews became stereotyped as socialists and communists and radicals in the 19th and the 20th centuries. We'll talk a lot more about this as well later in the talk. And, for some of these things, there are kinds of origins of this, and I'll talk a little bit about the origins of this in the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, 1918. But it's important to see, these things might have like one kernel of several, some people, but it's not sort of the ways that they were equated with radicalism. And then dual loyalty. This actually comes from, as I described to you, Jews, being sort of kicked out of, a nation where they sort of had some control in the land of Israel and living in diaspora throughout the world, living in countries all over the world for centuries. There was a pervasive belief that they were more loyal to other Jews around the world than to the country in which they live. So this is a flyer that was found, I believe, in 2018 in New Jersey. I'm sorry, I don't have the data with me, but this was this image that Jews go back to Israel when the vast majority of American Jews are not from Israel and would not be going back to it. This is from the Daily Stormer, which is a neo-Nazi group. So I am going to stop. So when so I've done this, and we're going to go on to sort of more sort of discussion of American anti-Semitism. But given the sort of the ugly images that I just presented, and given sort of some of some of the painful legacies of some of the things that I just described, and you may do this with your students as well. I just sort of included this kind of personal reflection space. You certainly don't have to do this, but I think it's kind of worth kind of thinking about whether you had any emotional responses. If you have any questions that I can clarify for you, anything that sort of like this is kind of like light bulb moment, like anything that sort of like resonates with something you've heard or seen, or anything that was left out that you would like to add. And I certainly didn't talk when I do other talks of lectures like this. I will sometimes talk about more tropes, but these are the ones that I think are the most significant for what we're going to talk about later in the talk. So I will just leave it there, and I'll just ask if there are any questions that I can answer, if anybody wants to share anything.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. And I would encourage everyone to take a look at the personal reflection slide. And if you're so moved, go ahead and include your responses in the chat, if you will, whether it's an emotional, things you found confusing, or questions, light bulb moments you had, or anything you felt was left out. One of the questions that we have asked about are anti-Semitic tropes. Are they part of QAnon conspiracy theories? I don't know if you have a response to that one.
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. And yes, I believe that most people identify that. Actually, QAnon, it's really interesting that you bring that up, because that involves a trope that I didn't even bring up here, which is the trope of Jews as child killers. So in the medieval era, a belief became inserted among many Christians that Jews every year during Passover, during this holiday actually, where we are, and right around Easter, which they're related, that Jews would kidnap a Christian child and kill them for use of their blood in matzahs, in the ritual bread that Jews eat, or the ritual food that Jews eat during this holiday. And so that vision of Jews as sort of preying on children. Yes, many people absolutely believe that QAnon's vision of a conspiracy of, sort of all of these elites, preying on children, that is absolutely borrowing from some of these conspiracy theories. Yes, very much so.
Very good. Thank you for that response. We have another question as well. How do you explain the hatred towards Jews? Like if a young student asks, but why were they hated so much? How would you go about answering and teaching this question? That's a great question. That's an authentic teacher experience question too. So
it
how
is.
would you?
And oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to speak over you. I was going to say I actually received the same question, like among my college students as well. Actually, it came very much out of the blue for me because I wasn't really giving this kind of in-depth talk about anti-Semitism. I was sort of briefly talking about some things in a larger lecture. And I guess, this is a part of another trope that I didn't include, which is just the idea of Jews as others. Since, Jews have been religious others since the moment of the foundation of Christianity. Jews have been seen as, and probably earlier, I'm not as ancient history is not as much, but certainly as soon as Christianity developed, it saw itself as being, different from Jews, and that kind of othering, I think, in the same way that probably you talk about racism against other groups, right? Sort of the ability to find another group that was different, and that all the negative feelings that you had could be projected on them. I mean, this is probably also, it's harder for historians to answer. There's probably psychological, answers as well. But I do think that there's a history of Jews being scapegoated and really just being kind of treated as others, right? People who, and then that kind of enabled them to become kind of a receptacle for hatred. So like Jews as being related to money, right? Jews, there are non-Jews who work in money too, right? But when Jews worked in money, sort of the hatred towards Jews became kind of associated with their work in financial, with money. And so I think that it would be, I think in that way, and I think if you're teaching American history, that can be useful because it is a way that we can talk about other kinds of groups who have similarly faced hatred, right? That they're others. I don't know if that's helpful. You have a younger group, so I don't know how that works, but that would at least be part of how I would answer.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful. And I'll ask one more question, then we'll move on. The question is if Christianity and Judaism have the same roots and Jesus was a Jew, how can Christian denominations be anti-Semitic? Wouldn't that be against Jesus since Jesus was also a cultural Jew?
Yeah, and that's actually, I mean, that would probably be a stronger, or at least someone who might be able to answer that better, somebody who's actually a historian of Christianity, who can talk more about sort of how that gets founded. But I would say that my understanding, certainly some of the ways that people talk about some elements of anti-Semitism is about supersessionism, right? Is the idea that, in sort of that formation of ideas about othering of Jews as others, is that Christianity kind of superseded Jews, right? That's a lot of the way that Christians sometimes might talk about Jews. The concept of the New Testament, for example, right, suggests that there was an Old Testament that's been superseded, right, that there's a better one, right, that Jews haven't learned that lesson. And I think that kind of in that origin of sort of needing, early Christians sort of wanting to say that they were right? They had done it right, and Jews hadn't gotten the message. I think that's where some of those feelings came from.
All right. Good deal. Thank you for that response. And again, I invite everyone again to take a look at the personal reflection slide and maybe add that to your teacher toolkit. Maybe something you can use after the webinar. That's all we have for now. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. So I guess I'll move on then to my next slide, into the next section. So I'll just give you a little bit to talk about the way that I'm organizing the rest of the panel. So it's it's predominantly chronological. I sort of have a note to myself to kind of note that this is the 20th century, but I start my 20th century class with Reconstruction, so you'll forgive me for going a little bit back into the 19th century. So I'm going to arrange it in 4 different parts, and I'm going to just kind of be organizing it, in particular moments. So this is by no means a comprehensive discussion of anti-Semitism in the 20th century. I've selected 4 events, kind of key moments and events, or things, moments that I want to talk about. And so this is the first one. Part 2 is going to be about Reconstruction. And before I get started, I do sort of want to sort of make something, or sort of bring your attention to something, which is that we have this picture here of Reconstruction, which is the cover of Eric Foner's book on Reconstruction. If you've read that or use it for your classes, or you read it in college or master's program, this is the cover. And it's this very kind of classic picture of Reconstruction, which of course deals with African Americans, which is, in general what Reconstruction was about. So it may seem kind of incongruous to be talking about anti-Semitism within Reconstruction. And I want to sort of use that as kind of a jumping off point to sort of say more broadly what the beginning points I want to make about American Jewish history and anti-Semitism, which is that American Jewish history, and that's my central field, frequently hasn't talked a lot about anti-Semitism. It's been something that has frequently been kind of a backstory, or something that people have not talked as much about. Probably the past 10 years or so, that's been changing. And certainly the recent spiraling of anti-Semitism in American life and American culture is a huge reason for that. But in general, people haven't really foregrounded it. They've focused on American Jewish life or American Jewish successes. They've contrasted American anti-Semitism with European anti-Semitism, which obviously was far more murderous, far more violent, and devastating. And so American anti-Semitism has tended not to be spoken about as much. If you read, so this first part that I'm going to talk about comes from, I suggested 2 readings for you, and it comes from one of them. And she actually spends a good amount of time sort of talking about some of the problems of how American Jewish historians haven't really focused on anti-Semitism. They've kind of downplayed it. And so this is kind of an effort to kind of bring the discussion of American anti-Semitism into our discussion of American Jewish history, and hopefully into a discussion of American history. I understand someone in the chat sort of mentioned that they don't talk about that, and I understand that. When I talk about, I teach U.S. history classes, and I don't always talk about American Jews or anti-Semitism within that. But, I hope that this is, I think that the article that I suggested in this piece maybe can give some suggestions of ways that it can be broadened, that it can be understood as a part of the larger American story. So I'm going to start with the story of Joseph Seligman. So he was a prominent Jewish banker who had emigrated to the United States from Bavaria, from the German state of Bavaria, at the age of 18, and had become, a fairly prominent banker. He helped to fund the Union cause. He helped to raise money for uniforms and for other elements of the battle. And because of that, he was friends with Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant. He was a prominent Jewish man. His family, for years after the Civil War, before the Civil War, had been visiting this beautiful hotel, the Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga Springs. And his family had been going there for about a decade, right after the Civil War. And then in 1877, May 13th, 1877, his family went to this resort to have their vacation. And the hotel manager, Henry Hilton, who is indeed the ancestor of the current Hilton hotel chain, told them that they were unwelcome because they were Jews. Now, Jews had been sort of excluded from things before, but this, because of his stature, made headlines throughout the country. Headlines, and importantly, headlines saw this as an issue of civil rights. They didn't see this as kind of, a minor issue of some wealthy man, not being able to socialize with other wealthy men. It was seen as a civil rights issue. So headlines announced civil rights in peril, civil rights for the Jew. One newspaper from Kansas wrote, "Hilton is in direct defiance of the established law of the United States." And another one wrote, "The hotel, while managed for private gain, is in a qualified sense a public institution," right? So people throughout the country saw this as an issue of civil rights. Now, there were other people who sort of clapped back, and you can see this is, I use this cartoon a lot in talking with students about anti-Semitism developing at this moment. This is taking the other side. But the headlines I gave you were obviously taking Seligman's part. This cartoon from Harper's, you can see, is quite anti-Semitic. It features this really ugly image of Seligman imagining him as this kind of stereotypical Jew with a hooked nose and a long beard, and these ugly plaid pants, which was actually a really common trope that 19th century and early 20th century cartoons used to figure Jews. And you can see the clerk says, "I'm very sorry, but my orders are obviously not to let you into this hotel." And the tourist says, in this very kind of caricatured Jewish accent, yes, I know all about your orders, but how else did you know it? I wasn't a Christian," right? So clearly identifying that he is a Jew, he cannot speak English properly, he is ugly, he is vulgar, he is not dignified and does not belong at this institution, which was frankly the defense of Henry Hilton. While, other people sort of said, and in fact it was true, that he was violating multiple common law rulings concerning innkeepers' obligations, the concept of innkeeper's duty from English law and established in American law throughout the 19th century. Hotels were supposed to be public services, and it was an indictable offense not to receive or provide for a guest. New York's 1873 Civil Rights Statute forbade the exclusion of citizens from public accommodations because of their race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And then there was a Federal Civil Rights Act of 1875, which also throughout the country barred individuals from places of a public accommodation because of race, color, or condition of servitude. This was the last of the Reconstruction laws. So this cartoon sort of suggests, oh, he's vulgar, so we shouldn't let him in. But in fact, law at the time was probably pretty decidedly against Hilton. Individuals definitely thought that Seligman had a case. Seligman contacted a lawyer, Edward Lauterbach, who absolutely believed that he should file suit. Lauterbach hosted a meeting of Jewish communal leaders in New York City, and he called on them to challenge this legally. But it is important to note that this is in the midst of a retrenchment from Reconstruction. So in 1877, the timing of this is really key, and this is a later image, but beginning in 1876, 1877, really 1875, which is why the Civil Rights Act was initially passed, white supremacists in the South began trying to segregate Black Americans everywhere they possibly could, obviously in railways, in streetcars, in hotels, in public theaters, in all kinds of places, right? And as this is developing, white supremacists in the South are using arguments that sound remarkably similar to the arguments that Henry Hilton is using when he defends himself against charges that he is behaving illegally. He says, oh, this is a business decision, it's not discrimination. He says Christians don't want to be near Jews, and his hotel would lose business. And that is precisely the argument that whites are using in the South to explain why they should be able to discriminate against blacks in their railway cars, in their theaters, in their hotels, in all these kinds of places. He also says this is, Jews are interested in social equality, right? Jews want to integrate. They want to get near non-Jews. They want to sort of become a part of a non-Jewish society. And frankly, Christians don't want that kind of social equality. And that is clearly the argument that is being made in the South, that integration is endangering or is threatening social equality. And that is, sort of becomes the kind of a bugbear, right? Becomes kind of the thing that is the most anxiety provoking for white Southerners, or it is stated that that's the most anxiety provoking. He also says that as an innkeeper, he has the right to decline service. And there is basically a conflict here that is going on in the 19th century, where innkeepers are saying, I can decline private service. I don't need to, I shouldn't have to serve just anyone. There's an 1836 Supreme Court case that says that you can keep out people who are vulgar. It is a Jenks decision. Vulgar, loud, rude, obnoxious. It's meant to respond to people who are drunk or disorderly conduct. And yet Hilton is using terms like vulgar and gross to refer to Jews in an effort to sort of align himself with this kind of changing vision of what hotel owners can do. So it's important to note, Seligman's lawyer wanted to sue Hilton, but Seligman did not do so. It's not clear why, but he chose not to. And African Americans at this time are suing. They are fighting back legally. And what winds up happening is that judges, ultimately, Black Americans are initially filing suit, and they are finding that they are less and less getting success, that those suits are not particularly successful. They move themselves to the Supreme Court, first in the civil rights cases of 1883, which invalidated the Civil Rights Act of 1875 and said that the federal government could not interfere with individual rights to commit private discrimination. Quote, the wrongful act of an individual, unsupported by any such authority, any state authority, is simply a private wrong or a crime of that individual. And then, of course, Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 ruled that cases regarding segregation, that the 14th Amendment could not invalidate state laws that mandated state segregation. So the combination of the civil rights cases and Plessy v. Ferguson basically showed that judges were not going to listen to any legal cases. So while Jews felt uncomfortable protesting in law, ultimately Blacks' strategy to fight back in the law was not looked upon favorably by the Supreme Court, and ultimately was lost as a potential strategy for civil rights activists for 75 years. And this winds up, and so I think it's really useful to sort of see the Seligman controversy, which for a long time was just kind of seen as kind of this kind of outcropping of kind of social discrimination, as really being sort of a part of, obviously not as violent and not as state mandated, but you can see it happening along the same lines at the same time with the same kinds of arguments as took place against Black Americans in Reconstruction. And you can see the same kinds of denial of civil rights taking place for both Blacks and Jews at this time. And you can see substantial legacies that wind up remaining throughout the 20th century. So this is another, Seligman does, Hilton does this in 1877. He gets no legal charge. Then pretty famously, a few years later, another hotelier in Rockaway Beach does the same thing and results in a number of other sort of ugly stereotype divisions of Jews. And it ultimately winds up meaning that there is substantial discrimination against Jews in hotels and inns throughout the country in the 20th century. So this is an image of an advertisement from 1906. You can see at the bottom we have no Hebrew patronage. A lot of times in keepers, particularly in places like New York, which had state civil rights prevention against these kinds of things, they nonetheless innkeepers created all kinds of coded language and coded ways of keeping out Jews. So this is pretty explicit. We have no Hebrew patronage. When that became illegal in New York, innkeepers would say things like restricted clientele in their ads, or they would say things like churches nearby, for example. And, you know, even as that became, as those terms became identified as discriminatory advertising that could be counted as illegal by 1913, they found other ways to sort of get around that. And there was really no legal recompense. And so for you know, really through until the 50s, and I'll talk more about this later in the talk, but 50s, 60s, there is legal segregation, and hotels Jews cannot attend, cannot go to, clubs Jews cannot go to, schools Jews are kept out of. There's a whole host of legacies in the Civil Rights Act and Plessy v. Ferguson for Jews as well as for Black Americans. That's the bulk of what I have there, and I'm happy to take any questions that people have.
Good deal. Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who continues to, participate in the audience chat. Thanks to our TAs for all that you're doing as well as the participant contributions of resources, articles, and just your overall thoughts. We have 2 questions that have come in. I'll bring them to your attention now. One is from Carolyn. The question is just, in a course I recently took, the leader discussed that Jews were historically often prevented from entering other professions except financial. How does this contribute to the quote-unquote greedy capitalist trope?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of kind of reconsideration at scholarly levels about sort of where the origins of this trope come from, but certainly so basically I want to say it's not, Jews are not the only ones who are engaged in financial activities, but it is true that Jews are kept out of other kinds of professions. So that's certainly true. Jews are kept out of medieval guilds, for example. They, so not able to be, bakers. So they can do it within their own communities. But as far as I understand, that is correct. And then also Jews were frequently prevented from owning land. And so that also, when in an era when people are farmers, that also prevented them from doing that as well. So I believe that is true.
Okay, very good. And again, I believe you actually answered the other question we have, which was essentially, does the idea of Jew as moneylender come from the idea that they were the only ones allowed to lend money in the Middle Ages?
Yeah, so they're not the only ones, but it is true that they do go into those trades, and the previous question is correct. There are not other things that they can do a lot of times, and so they do do those professions more. And then say, for example, princes might use, particular one Jewish family, right, or a Jewish group to be sort of money lenders, right, to sort of to be the ones that work with money. And so that impression came about. So that's sort of ideas about Rothschilds, if you've heard of that. That is sometimes how that kind of impression gets made. But it is not the bulk of Jews. I mean, the bulk of Jews in Europe and in the Middle East were poor. They, might have dealt with money, but they would have been peddlers. They would have been quite poor, and they would not have been wealthy, sort of. So to talk about Jews working with money a lot of times would have meant that they were peddling goods, or that they operated as middlemen, or, they would frequently, or they would be, working rag picking or other kinds of work like that.
Right. Great. Thank you so much. I believe that's all the question we have for now. We
Okay.
have about 39 more minutes remaining. We're doing great on time, and again, thank you so much for our participants. If you should have any additional questions, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A chat box. But other than that, we can move ahead. Thank you so much.
Okay, sure, absolutely, yeah. Okay, and I should say, actually, I'll move on here, and I'll say that in my so some of the elements of these are things that others have written about, right, that are not my original research. And the two parts that I'm going to be presenting now are things that some of it is material that I'm working with, and actually the part that I'm going to do now is actually quite new. This is out of the archives that I've just been looking at, so it's brand new. So I love questions. I would actually really appreciate if you have questions, or and certainly know that it's kind of being newly tested out. So I don't know if that's okay to sort of say, but this is one of the first times I've presented it, and it's still fairly new. So I really welcome any kind of feedback that you all have. So this next part is going to be about immigration, anti-Semitism, and the Emergency Quota Act of 1882-1921. I don't know if any of you use this image in your teaching when you talk about immigration. I think it can be, I sometimes use it as a fruitful kind of way of thinking about, how the photographer is kind of picturing immigration, sort of what this, what is trying to be communicated there. I'm going to come back to this picture later, so kind of keep it in mind. It's done by a man named Edwin Levick, and it's a fairly famous photo, but you might want to think about certainly what this communicates about the millions of people who are coming to the United States, particularly during this time in the period really from 1880 to 1920, 24. There are 20 million immigrants coming to the United States, and roughly 2 million Jews came to the United States between 1880 and 1924. Most of them are coming from Eastern Europe. They are fleeing persecution and violence, as well as seeking better economic circumstances. This is a really wonderful picture of a young Russian Jewish woman taken by a sympathetic photographer, who again is on my notes, and his name is escaping me, but he's one of the most famous photographers of immigrants of Ellis Island. The choosing a woman as the image here is really important. It is important to note, and I usually do talk with my students about Jews being slightly different from a lot of the other immigrants at this time, because much of what is pushing them is violence and persecution, which women and children and older people are also subject to. So it is not usually the same kind of profile as other groups, because they are facing this kind of persecution and violence. I'm going to talk a little bit more about particular incidences of that really help to sort of motivate Jewish immigration. But at any rate, you can see that there are millions of Jews, probably the vast majority of American Jews who live in the United States today. Their ancestors came during this kind of key period when 2 million Jews emigrated. And as Jews are coming during this period, as millions of Jews and millions of immigrants are coming during this period, elite Americans are working to restrict immigration. So you can see this picture that I just showed you, which is not necessarily, my students don't always see it as being seen as, a huge warning, but you can see that in this elite magazine, elite Americans, native-born Americans are clearly seeing this as, hordes of unfit, you can see, immigrants, seeking to take over the country. And you probably talk with your students about the wide and far-reaching efforts to sort of restrict immigration during this period. 1875, 1882, 1905, a lot of the most successful of those limitations are Asian immigration, right? And as that is successful, then increasingly immigration restrictionists tried to move to European restrictions. And I don't know whether, I mean, sometimes I will give people lists. I didn't do this here, but, the immigration acts at various times, ban people likely to become a public charge, criminals, insane, and some of the language they use is horrible. And I'm sure you talk about that with your students, people with a loathsome and a contagious disease, people who are illiterate. There are all these efforts to keep out immigrants. And they are concerned about Jews as well as many of the other kind of immigrants from Europe. But really, those categories don't always work. They certainly don't work as well as these restrictionists think they're going to work. And they are at different times, right, focused on Asian immigrants, they're focused on Italian immigrants, they're focused on different immigrants. I've become really interested recently in the years between 1918 and 1921 and the success of the strategy of the quota. So what I'm going to talk about is some of the reasons why I think these years between 1918 and 1921 are so important, why they're really reflective of anti-Semitism, the ways that anti-Semitism at that moment shaped certainly the government conversation about immigration. There's a confluence of events that are taking place right between 1918 and 1921 that made Jews in particular really frightening and dangerous, and helped to inspire the emergency of the Emergency Quota Act. So if you see, and actually I can just say as an historian, I've seen this term all the time, but I've never really seen anybody talk what's the emergency in 1921? Why is there an emergency in the title of this act? And what I want to argue and sort of talk about is the ways that I think the emergency is Jews, because this is really kind of a crucial moment for Jews, and it's a crucial moment in the perception of Jews. It's a crucial moment in anti-Semitism, in American anti-Semitism as well. So let me explain three things that I think are really key in making this into a crucial moment. One of them, I sort of mentioned, is the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 to 1918. This is clearly a terrifying moment for Americans in general. They see, sort of this major country becoming communist, which seems really terrifying, which, is terrifying to Americans supporting capitalism, and it's victorious, which is really terrifying. It is really important to recognize that the Bolsheviks, that the notion of Bolshevik, Lenin, who is pictured here, right, was of half Jewish ancestry, or was reputed to be of half Jewish ancestry. Trotsky was himself Jewish. There were, a small number of the sort of Bolshevik circle who were Jews. It was by no means the vast majority. It was by no means majority Jewish. And the vast majority of Jews in Russia were not revolutionaries, were not radicals. But the perception in Russia, and it became really a worldwide perception that Bolsheviks were Jews. That it became actually equated. If you use the term Bolsheviki, you meant Jew. It was Jews were equated with Reds, with radicals. And if reading a lot of the documents, I spent my summer actually in the National Archives reading documents in the State Department and in Congress, and it's really tremendous the degree to which there are these documents that sort of describe the revolution as being completely about the Jews taking from the peasants and being there to sort of put their feet on the backs of peasants. And they really sort of identify Jews as Bolsheviks. So that means that any Jews who are seeking to emigrate are potential radicals, right? And so there's a huge Red Scare, which you probably do teach about, or you may teach about with your students, and that usually gets seen in sort of that there are radicals in the country who are deported, but we don't talk quite as much about the fear of radicalism and the way that it actually helps to change the perception of people thinking about who's going to come into the country, and the perception that the people coming into the country are going to be Bolsheviks and the perception that most of those Bolsheviks are going to be Jewish. So that's one piece of the context that makes Jews seem like an emergency in this moment, is that any Jew could potentially be a radical set to bring down the U.S. government. The next element is the protocols of the elders of Zion. So what I mentioned during sort of the tropes earlier. So the protocols was actually a document from 1905. It was published in Russia. It was actually a document from the Tsarist government seeking to kind of scapegoat Jews for all the problems going on in Russia before the revolution. It was translated into English and brought to the United States in 1918. It is brought to the U.S. by a Russian expatriate, Boris Brussel, who is virulently anti-Semitic, and he distributed it through the U.S. government. So the protocols, and I'll give you a little bit more depth into sort of describing what it is. So it kind of claims to be minutes of a meeting of the world's Jewish leadership, of which there is no such thing, but the world's Jewish leadership and their conspiracy to bring down Western civilization so that they can govern the world themselves. And it's kind of written as this series of protocols where they talk about sort of what they're going to do, how they're going to take over the world. And I was really struck to sort of see this. It shows up in all of these U.S. government spaces. It shows up in State Department papers. It shows up in military papers. It shows up in congressional papers. It actually shows up as a congressional document, like in congressional galleys. And some of the accompanying notes that come along with the protocols from some people, not all American federal officials, but some of them, say, oh, wow, this actually makes sense of what's going on. We've just had this Bolshevik revolution. We see these wealthy Jews in America, and we see these poor European Jews trying to get in and wealthy American Jews helping them. All of this is explained by this conspiracy theory in the protocols. And so it seems to make a huge amount of sense, and it's circulating throughout the government, right? And people are sort of seeing this as a live danger to the country. So Congress is holding hearings where people are talking about this, right, as a danger. The State Department is being made aware of this. It is bringing it to the attention of prominent Jews. It's not clear that everyone by any means in the State Department believes it, but I'm going to talk about some people who do. And military intelligence absolutely believes, a lot of people in military intelligence really believe all of this. They begin keeping tabs on all these Jews in America because they believe that they are planning world domination. So it's exposed as a fraud. It is not real, right? So I should have said that in the beginning. I usually do say this is a forgery. It was exposed in 1920, 1921. It's exposed as a fraud and a forgery. And yet it comes to kind of take on a life of its own. And I'll talk a little bit about, I certainly think it sets a context for a lot of people in America, in the government and outside the government, to really believe that there is something going on. Henry Ford's The Dearborn Independent, if you talk with your students about that, Henry Ford basically takes the protocols and makes them into an American document. And millions of people read that and believe that, right? But as it shows up in 1919, 1920, people in the federal government really think that this might be the case. It seems to be explaining what's going on in Russia, and they kind of want to know what to do about it. The final element of context, I'll say, is the aftermath of World War I, which is a disaster for Jews. There's been some recent historians who have really started to pay attention to this in a way because World War II, because of the Holocaust, was so devastating for Jews. World War I tends to be forgotten, and so there are now historians really, I think, correctly drawing our attention to World War I and talking about, World War II has overshadowed it, but actually before World War II, World War I was one of the most devastating, if not the most devastating event to occur in modern in the modern moment for world Jewry. 100,000 Jews are killed in violent pogroms in Ukraine and Poland in 1919. Jews are being displaced. They're losing their national identities. They're being denationalized and stateless in places like Romania. They are facing poverty, displacement, chaos, disease. And so they are seeking to emigrate to the United States in large numbers. And so they are moving, they are trying to find their way to get to the United States. And it is these Jews who, the picture that you're looking at, by the way, is the desecration of Torah scrolls in 1920 in Russia, I believe in Kiev, in Ukraine, during these pogroms. But so Jewish people who are facing this kind of violence and this kind of persecution, they are looking to get out. They are looking to come to the United States. And there are American organizations like the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, the Joint Distribution Committee, that are funded by American Jewish charities who are trying to help them. And the combination of these three things, to State Department, to consuls in the State Department, on the ground in Warsaw, in Poland, in Romania, in all over Eastern Europe, they see Jews who are traumatized, who are the victims of violence, who are poor, who sometimes have typhus or other kinds of communicable diseases, who are hungry and who want to come to the United States, and who are being funded by American organizations. And the State Department, with the context of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, saying this is a part of a large world conspiracy that helps us to explain the Bolshevik Revolution, that helps us to understand this worldwide Jewry. The State Department sees this and they say this is really dangerous. So this is documents that I found there where they say, we see this correspondence about Polish Jews, and I am now worried about these people coming into the country. And so the State Department acts. They reach out to Congress. They reach out to restrictionists in Congress, people who have been seeking to ban immigration. And they say, what can we do? How can we get together to put limits or stop these Jews from coming into the country? They released two reports. One legislative, one gets released in the media, that say, that have pages of consulate reports about Jews that say things like, the great mass of aliens that we see, looking to emigrate, are Russian Poles or Polish Jews of the usual ghetto type. They are filthy, un-American, and often dangerous in their habits. This is in a Senate report, House of Representatives report on the Emergency Quota Act. This kind of language is circulated, right, throughout the country, right, in press reports and in legislative reports. And then people, so what I have an image of here is from a kind of a patriotic group that uses the language of this report to argue, to try to convince congressmen to ban immigrants. And this is the push, right? This creates the emergency, and it creates the groundswell, and it creates the language for the passage of the Emergency Quota Act, which winds up becoming an incredibly successful strategy for keeping out immigrants. It keeps out 3%. You all probably know it because you probably teach it to your students, but it restricted each nation's immigrants to 3%, each European nation's immigrants to 3% of their representation in the 1910 census. And that formula winds up being tightened and made much tighter in 1924. And people usually talk about the 24 National Origins Act as really what cuts off immigration, and that's correct. And that becomes much, much, much broader. So it's not just about Jews by any means. It becomes much broader about all, new immigrants. But I think it's really important to see the ways that anti-Semitism and the dire straits of Jewish experiences right in this period between 1918 and 1921 really help to motivate and construct this kind of this strategy that winds up restricting immigration in the 1920s and 1930s, and ultimately winds up, not only keeping out all immigrants, but contributing to the Holocaust by not allowing in Jewish refugees from Hitler's Germany and Nazi-occupied Europe. Okay, so that was a lot. I'll take a break there and ask if there's any questions. And again, this is all new, so please, any questions you have, I'd really appreciate.
Good deal. Good deal. All right. Thank you. Yeah. We have 2 questions. We have about 18 minutes, I would say 20 minutes remaining. But the questions that we have, first is from Mike. His question is during Reconstruction, Southern states imposed poll taxes and literacy tests on blacks to prevent them from voting. Were Jews ever discriminated against from participating in the democratic process in the United States?
That's a great question. Not necessarily in voting. I mean, after it had become the United States. So the colonies, absolutely. There are Christian Massachusetts, right, is a place where Jews do not land because they are treated as, they're heretics. But even after the foundation of the United States in 1789, a lot of the colonies had political, you'd had to have an oath, you'd have to testify to an oath to Christ, to serve on a jury, to hold political office. And the Bill of Rights, actually Madison's initial vision of the Bill of Rights is that it will prevent states from doing this, but the ultimate Bill of Rights actually only prevents the federal government from having political oaths. And so actually throughout the late 18th, early 19th century, there are states where Jews cannot hold office, can't serve on juries, so they can vote, but there are other elements of the political process that they're limited from. But there are no poll taxes, there are no literacy tests on voting. That is something that Jews do not face. And they are perceived of, Jews who are white, Jews who come from Eastern Central Europe, which, as I said in the beginning, is the vast majority of them, they are perceived of as white, and so they can be naturalized as citizens.
Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for that response. That was a big one for our American History 1 and U.S. History teachers. Good deal. The next question, really quickly. Thank you so very much. How can all of this great info help to explain our recent large increase in anti-Semitism in the United States in the last 3 to 5 years? That's from Jeremy. I know it's a relatively broad question.
It is a broad question. Actually, I'm so sorry that I talked so long. I told you that this might happen, Mike, because this is new material. I'm so sorry. No,
we're going to move ahead. We'll continue on. We'll push ahead. Thank you.
The last section of this is on that. So I actually wonder, I'll try to go real quickly through my next one, and then I can, if that's something that people are interested in, I can try to get to that so that I apologize for going so slowly.
It's perfectly fine. Please continue on. Take your time.
Okay.
We'll adjust it.
Yeah, no, I'll try to just swing through this. This is my research. This is my more long-standing research, which is on name changing and anti-Semitism, which really sort of deals with mostly the middle of the 20th century. And what I have here is a name change petition in city court of a family named Max Greenberger that was seeking to change their name from Greenberger to Green. And what I argue is that this is actually in a lot of ways a continuation and an expansion of the civil rights or the attacks on Jewish civil rights, which existed for Jews throughout much of the first half of the 20th century. So Jews faced employment discrimination. It might be hard to see, I'm not sure, but you can see if you look at this help wanted ad, you can see that people are saying, I want a bookkeeper or I want a statistician and they should be Protestant. I need a college grad and they should be Christian. I need a floor guard, they should be Christian. This is perfectly legal because of the Civil Rights Act or because of the civil rights cases that I talked about before. Jews are discriminated against in education. So there are quotas. This is an application for admission to Harvard for John F. Kennedy, actually, that asked all kinds of questions trying to figure out who is Jewish. What does your father do? Where was your father born? Is your father naturalized as a citizen? Has anyone in your family changed their name? What's your mother's maiden name? These are all questions that were making an effort to try to figure out who were Jewish, in part because they knew so many Jews changed their names because they were being discriminated against. Harvard and Columbia, beginning in the 19-teens and then all the way through post-World War II era, kept significant quotas on Jews and worked hard to try to figure out who the Jews were. And so because of the significant employment discrimination and education discrimination, which is all completely legal, it may be veiled, but it's really legal, Jews cannot get work. So I have petitions here, a woman named Doris Sarietzky changed her name to Doris Watson in order to facilitate securing work. Bertram Levy changed his name to Bertram Lewis in order to get jobs, to get business from people. People changed their name because sort of identifiably Jewish names meant that they could not get work. There sometimes people imagine that this changed during World War II. There's a strong sense that, this is an image of the movie Baton, right, where you see all the troops and there's always a Jewish troop and the Jewish troops always get along and support one another. There's also a strong image that during the Holocaust, right, that the Holocaust changed things and that, people became aware of anti-Semitism and that therefore they stopped being anti-Semitic. But actually, in this research, and I actually will blow through this. I won't go through this in great detail. This is an anti-Semitic cartoon, poem that got told during World War II. Constantly, this circulated everywhere during World War II. There was a huge amount of anti-Semitism that circulated during World War II that actually led many veterans and their families to change their names because of the anti-Semitism they experienced. And then, in fact, after World War II, the numbers of name changers actually goes up. 1946 sees the highest number of name changers throughout the 20th century. So I would kind of argue that if you use name changing as this kind of strategy that Jews are using to try to get jobs or to try to get into colleges, that they are actually doing it because they are facing anti-Semitism like this, or because they're facing like this poem, or because they're facing structural anti-Semitism. They can't get jobs. They can't get into schools. And that actually does not go away after World War II in the way that we would think. I'm getting moved past that. This is from a letter from 1947. Dear Miss, name redacted, it is with regret that we are obliged to return your application, but our Jewish quota has been filled for some time. So it's open, it's not illegal, and Jews are really still facing this kind of hatred after World War II. It suggests it doesn't go away, and that kind of institutionalized anti-Semitism has real impact on generations of Jews who change their names or find other ways to try to get around in life. So I'm going to stop there. Sorry, I just kind of blew through that really quickly so that I could maybe get to the final part and maybe be able to answer that wonderful question. And I see that maybe we can go a little bit later, so I'll just let you know that, name changing continues so much after World War II. This is a still from a wonderful movie. If you're ever interested in showing for your students, I showed to the students the movie Gentleman's Agreement, which is kind of a movie about anti-Semitism in 1948. that 47, it won Best Picture Oscar in 1948, that really dramatizes anti-Semitism and talks about sort of the problems of anti-Semitism, but has really ugly things to say about name changers, in part because Jews perceive it as a problem after World War II, that so many people are or have changed their names. So this is still, it's to let you know that it still is really something that the Jewish community is grappling with, and that actually the broader American public is being made aware of the ways that anti-Semitism shapes and affects Jews' lives. So sorry, I kind of blew through all that really quickly, but I'll see if there are any questions. If anybody has anything that they'd like to ask, I'd be more than happy to. I apologize. I hate doing this. Time management is not my strength, but if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them.
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good. Actually, I believe we responded to all the questions right now, so we're fine to continue on if you would like.
All right.
Yeah,
Okay. Well, that's great. Yeah. Well, sure. So this actually, so I did want to be able to respond to. Oh, actually, Mike, would you mind just repeating the question that the last person asked that I was going to try to answer?
Okay. Yes, and the question, and that was from Jeremy. His question was, how can all of this great info help to explain our recent large increase in anti-Semitism in the U.S. in the last 3 to 5 years?
Yeah. So, I mean, I am going to, so this, I think that what I would say is that this, I think that what I showed earlier is kind of a grounding, the significance of the protocols, the significance of seeing Jews as radicals. All of that becomes really significant through the post-war era. And certainly we can see it through today, although I can tell you that I certainly would never have expected that anybody would ask me that, 5 to 7 years ago, I would never have expected somebody would ask me that question. I didn't even begin my research on name changing because I imagined that people were going to I never imagined that people would ever ask me that question. I would never have seen, I never imagined that I would see what we've been seeing. So this, yes, I think that images of the protocols and Jews as radicals, I think, have continued to make their way into post-World War II history all the way through to today. So let me offer you, again, some elements of how we can see this. In 1950, 1958, 1957, 1958, there's a coordinated strike on 8 different synagogues throughout the South, bombings of synagogues throughout the South. This is an image of and some of those bombings are not successful, and some of them are. This is the bombing of a very famous temple. It's called the Temple in Atlanta. After this bombing, the temple received a phone call, a newspaper received a phone call. We bombed a temple in Atlanta. This is the last empty building we will bomb. Negroes and Jews are hereby declared aliens. In sort of radical white supremacy and white nationalism at this time, Jews were really seen as being responsible for what these groups called race mixing, and really for the radicalism of the civil rights movement. So some of this comes from like truly Jews in the South, particularly rabbis. There were a number of rabbis in the South who were outspoken in their support of civil rights. So this synagogue in Atlanta, the rabbi was actually quite supportive of civil rights. He spoke about it from the pulpit, and actually, unusually, his congregants supported him in this. They were behind him, and so people have sort of seen that as the origins of this strike. But it's also important to sort of note the ways that, not all Jews were necessarily supportive of civil rights, but there were racial groups developing at this time, racist groups, I should say, racialist or racist groups like the National States Rights Party, the Knights of the White Camellia, that took responsibility for these synagogue bombings. and who absolutely believe, they sort of brought together a number of white extremist far-right groups who believed that Jews controlled blacks, right? So they believed that blacks were so inferior, that they were so, I mean, it's disgusting to say, I can't even really say it, but they believed they were so, they weren't even human, right? So they could not possibly be responsible for the work of the civil rights movement. So it had to be Jews. The National States Rights Party, sort of said Jews are our real enemy. They are the ones we need to fight against because they are the ones controlling blacks and controlling the civil rights movement. So I would just, so you might want to see there kind of the language of sort of seeing Jews as radical, right? Jews as being connected to this radical movement. You might also want to connect it to kind of the replacement theory that people have talked about, that Jews are working to bring in or to aid people of color. I would also kind of bring it back to when I talked about the aid societies that were working to bring in Jewish immigrants in the 1920s. One of those societies is HIAS, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, which now works to bring in people of color, frequently Latinos, and that is also connected, right, to this vision of Jews as radical and sort of Jews seen as radical can be connected to kind of replacement theory, right? And so these ideas are connected, and I would urge you to kind of see this together. I would also kind of add something that I think is really interesting is that you continue to see the protocols at this moment. So in 1964, I could only find, I wasn't able to get an image of anything else. This is the New York Times reporting on the Senate in 1964 holding a hearing and determining that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a fraud, fabricated. But of course, I already told you that, right? Like people knew that in 1920, 1921. So why is the Senate coming out and saying this now in 1964? I think most likely, especially if you look through FBI tips at this time, that it is because the protocols in the midst of kind of the civil rights movement, that these white, radical, extreme, far-right groups are beginning to circulate. They are seeing the protocols as an answer to the radicalism of Jews in what they imagine is the radicalism of Jews in the civil rights movement. So the protocols are circulating at this time, and there's the flourishing of extreme white racist groups that are tying Jews to civil rights. And I think that is kind of sort of a beginning, or not a beginning, but we can see that kind of reemerging in the post-war era. It becomes particularly visible in the Turner Diaries, which I don't know if people have paid attention to. It became more visible quite recently after the attack on the Capitol. The Turner Diaries was a piece of dystopian fiction that came out in 1978. It imagined a world where the U.S. government was taking away guns while rapists and thugs are terrorizing ordinary people. Rapists and thugs, generally people of color. And this group, the organization, fights back with guerrilla warfare. And it absolutely ties the Jew. You can see in this quotation that I have here, the Jew, Jewish ideas, Jewish spirit are responsible for this violence of people of color, right? It's another iteration of kind of replacement theory and this image of Jews as radical, kind of enabling the takeover of people of color. It is worth noting Andrew MacDonald here is a pseudonym for William Pierce, who was a leading member of the American Nazi Party in 1967, became head of the National Alliance, which had the same goals of kind of destroying American society and replacing it with a pure Aryan order, which is both anti-Jewish and anti-all people of color. You can see direct ties from the Turner Diaries to the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, where 168 people were killed, Timothy McVeigh, the bomber, had excerpts of the Turner Diaries in his van. The diaries features a bombing of FBI headquarters with a truck, which is, basically McVeigh used this image from the Turner Diaries to destroy the Murrah Federal Building. The National Alliance saw its numbers, William Pierce's group saw its numbers expand in the wake of Oklahoma City, as people kind of identified this as being an act of white Christian nationalism. You also see the Turner Diaries showing up at the Capitol as well. And then, this is, if you want to go back to replacement theory, this was a picture of the Unite the Right rally where people shouted, "Jews will not replace us," right? Which I remember at the time, I had to understand, people had to have explained to us, but it is kind of connected to a lot of these images of Jews at the center of, at the origins of, radicalism, aid for immigrants, aid for people of color, through organizations like HIAS. I mean, it's not even Hebrew Immigration Aid Society. It's not even really about radicalism like communism. It's really about sort of immigration and aid like that. Okay, so I got there. I'm sorry for the rushing, but so I'm really glad that you asked that question, because that was clearly what my last unit was all about. So I'm glad that we got to get there. I'm sorry to have gone over for everyone, but I'm happy to take any other questions about either of these units.
That was absolutely awesome. Thank you so much. Outstanding job. And as I look through the audience chat, everyone is so thankful and appreciative and expressing gratitude to you for this session. And I know that once we upload the recording, our on-demand numbers will continue to grow. And so just thank you. And also, in the chat, it's gotten lost in all the thanks. There was a heartfelt response from Tanja. I want to tell Tanja, thank you for sharing that information about the incident when you were growing up. As well. But we really appreciate all the teachers who are here tonight. That will conclude our questions. There are no other questions that we have for now. And so, again, yes, I see you there, Tanja. But again, we appreciate you just being here, sharing your experience and guiding us in identifying anti-Semitic tropes and understanding how those tropes have affected American Jewish life. It was so important. Thank you to Rachel Lance and Bernadette May Beaver for your service on the Teacher Advisory Council, as well as your presence and contributions to the chat. I'd encourage you all to keep up with the happenings at the National Humanities Center via our various social media feeds to get updates on everything that's going on. I'd invite you all to check out our next webinar, which is actually this Thursday at 7:00 p.m., as you all know, this Thursday, April the 13th. The title is The N-Word in the Classroom, Teaching Racist Language Without Harm, with Elizabeth Storia Pryor. The last name may resonate with some of you all, but she will be here, and we're so fortunate to have her and to hear her thoughts on this important topic. And so, again, thank you so much, Dr. Fermaglich. We truly appreciate you. It's been awesome.
I just want to say thank you so much. Thank you to everyone. And if you have any questions, if anybody has any further questions, I'm happy to answer them. So thank you all so much. And thank you for all the work that you do teaching high school students. It's amazing, or all students. It's amazing. So thank you very much. And thank you, Mike, for facilitating.
Absolutely. And again, I will, if there are any questions, feel free to drop them in the manage Q&A box there. But otherwise, we will close out. We appreciate you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. It's great to see everyone. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we're going to have to get you back. Absolutely. Thank you.